"You don't get to decide who matters in this room," the deputy said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of clinking dishes and murmured conversations. And in that instant, every fork paused midair as if the entire diner had forgotten how to breathe. The scent of fresh coffee and fried bacon lingered heavy in the air, wrapping around the worn vinyl booths and checkered floor like something familiar, something safe, until it wasn't. Evelyn Brooks stood beside a small corner table, her hands steady despite the tremor that lived in her bones, the kind that came with 72 years of living, loving, and losing. "Didn't expect." A man at the counter lowered his gaze. A young couple in the booth by the window leaned closer together, unsure why their hands suddenly felt cold. Ryan let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and shook his head as if dismissing something he couldn't name. "You people always say that," he muttered, though there was less certainty in his tone now, like the edges of his confidence had begun to blur. Evelyn paused, the napkin hovering just above the table, her fingers lightly stained with coffee as the liquid seeped into the fabric. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced toward the front door, where the afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass in long, golden lines that stretched across the floor like quiet invitations. Outside, a car engine idled for a moment before shutting off, the sound barely noticeable, yet somehow distinct enough to shift something in the air. Inside, the room held its breath again, not out of fear this time, but anticipation, though no one could have said why. Evelyn set the napkin down gently, smoothing it with the palm of her hand, her expression unchanged, her posture still upright, still composed. There was no anger in her face, no trace of resentment. Only a quiet kind of strength that didn't ask to be seen, but refused to be ignored. And as the door handle slowly turned, letting in a sliver of brighter light that cut through the dim interior, something unseen began to move beneath the surface of that moment. Something waiting, something inevitable, like a truth that had taken its time, but had finally decided it was ready to be known. The bell above the diner door gave a soft, familiar chime as it opened, a sound that usually meant another regular coming in for a late lunch or a cup of coffee, but this time it carried a different weight, subtle yet undeniable, like a shift in the air pressure before a storm that no one had predicted. The sunlight followed first, stretching across the tiled floor in long, clean lines, catching the edges of chrome stools and glass sugar jars, making everything look sharper, more defined. Then the man stepped in. He was not dressed in uniform, not like the deputy, but there was something in the way he moved that made space adjust around him, not forcefully, not loudly, just naturally, as if the room recognized something before the people in it did. He paused just inside the doorway, letting the door close behind him with a soft click, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light of the diner. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply observed. His gaze moved across the room slowly, taking in the small details others had already learned to ignore, the untouched plates, the rigid shoulders of customers trying not to stare, the quiet tension that sat heavy between breaths. Then his eyes found her. Evelyn stood exactly where she had been, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other still near the napkin she had used to gather the spilled coffee. The faint stain on her fingers had begun to dry, but she had not noticed. Or perhaps she had and chosen not to care. Her posture remained the same, calm and grounded, but something in her eyes softened the moment she saw him, a flicker of recognition that did not need words. The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not shock, not anger, something deeper, something that tightened his jaw just enough to be seen if you were looking for it. He took a step forward, then another, his shoes making a quiet, measured sound against the floor, each step steady, deliberate. Conversations that had not fully resumed fell silent again, replaced by the subtle rhythm of his approach. Deputy Ryan Cole turned slightly, noticing the change in attention before he noticed the man himself. His brows drew together, irritation flickering across his face as he followed the line of sight that everyone else had already fixed on. "We are in the middle of something here," Ryan said, his voice carrying a hint of warning, as if asserting control would restore the balance he felt slipping. The man did not answer immediately. He stopped a few feet from Evelyn, close enough to see the fine lines in her face, the quiet strength that had settled into every part of her over the years, and the faint redness that lingered along her cheek, subtle but present. His eyes stayed there for a moment longer than expected, not because he needed to confirm what he was seeing, but because he understood what it meant. Evelyn gave the smallest nod, a gesture so slight it could have been missed entirely, but it was enough. Enough to say she was all right. Enough to say she did not need rescuing. Enough to say she trusted him to know what to do without being told. The man exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to gather the weight of the room into something he could carry. Then he turned his attention to Ryan, not with hostility, not with raised voice or sudden movement, but with a calm that felt heavier than anger. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone even, almost quiet, yet it landed with a clarity that cut through the tension like a line drawn in stone. Ryan straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his stance, as if responding to something he could not quite name. "Just handling a situation," he replied, though the certainty in his voice had thinned, stretched at the edges. The man's gaze did not waver. He did not step closer. He did not need to. The distance between them held its own kind of pressure, unspoken but unmistakable. Behind them, the ceiling fan continued its slow rotation, the soft hum filling the space between words, and somewhere near the counter, a glass was set down too quickly, the small clink echoing louder than it should have. Evelyn remained still, her presence steady, like an anchor in a room that had begun to drift. And in that quiet, in that fragile pause where everything seemed suspended between what had happened and what would come next, it became clear that something had already changed, even if no one had said it out loud yet. Ryan let out a short breath through his nose, the kind that usually came before a dismissive remark, but this time it lingered just a fraction too long, as if something inside him was recalculating. He shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly, his hand brushing near the badge on his chest in a gesture that had always grounded him, always reminded him of who he was in any given room. "Like I said," he repeated, slower now, "just handling a situation." The words sounded the same, but they did not land the same. The man standing across from him did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, not awkward, not uncertain, just deliberate, as if giving the moment space to reveal itself fully before stepping into it. His eyes moved once more, briefly, back to Evelyn, catching the way she stood without leaning, without shrinking, her presence quiet but unshaken. There was a steadiness in her that did not ask for defense, only recognition. That alone seemed to settle something inside him. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket slowly, not in a threatening way, not abrupt, just controlled, and pulled out a small leather wallet. The motion was simple, almost ordinary, yet every eye in the diner followed it. He flipped it open with practiced ease and held it at chest level, angled just enough for Ryan to see. The badge inside was not large, not flashy, but it carried a different kind of authority, the kind that did not need volume to be understood. Ryan's eyes flicked down to it, then back up, then down again, the shift in his posture almost immediate, almost involuntary. The tension in his shoulders tightened first, then straightened, as if he were suddenly aware of how he was being seen. "Marcus Brooks," the man said calmly, his voice even. "Internal affairs." The name hung in the air, not loud, not forced, but unmistakable. A murmur moved faintly through the diner, subtle but real, like a ripple across still water. Ryan swallowed, his jaw tightening again, but this time not out of confidence. "Sir," he said, the word coming quicker than he intended, edged with something closer to caution than respect. Marcus closed the wallet and slipped it back into his jacket without breaking eye contact. "I asked if there was a problem," he continued, his tone unchanged, steady, grounded, carrying no accusation, yet leaving no room for evasion. Ryan glanced briefly around the room, as if searching for something to anchor himself, but all he found were eyes that quickly looked away, shoulders that stiffened, a silence that no longer belonged to him. "It is under control," he replied, though the phrase felt thinner now, stretched across a moment that no longer supported it. Marcus nodded once, a small, measured movement, then took a step closer, closing just enough distance to make the conversation feel private even in a room full of people. "Then help me understand," he said quietly, his voice lowering just enough that others leaned in without realizing it. "Why a 72-year-old woman is standing here with coffee on the floor, in a room full of witnesses who have forgotten how to speak. The question did not rise. It settled, heavy, precise. Ryan's fingers flexed once at his side, then stilled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response forming and dissolving before it could take shape. Behind them, the hum of the diner seemed to fade further, replaced by the soft ticking of the wall clock above the counter, each second marking the space between what had been done and what would have to be answered for. Evelyn remained where she was, her gaze gentle, not fixed on either man but present in the moment itself, as if she understood that whatever came next was no longer about her alone. And in that suspended breath of time, it became clear that authority had shifted, not through force, not through noise, but through something far more difficult to challenge. Quiet, undeniable truth. Ryan's throat moved as he swallowed, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness that had settled over the diner. And for the first time since he had walked in wearing that badge like a shield, he seemed to realize that the room was no longer bending around him. He glanced again at Evelyn, just for a second, as if seeing her properly required effort now, as if the image he had formed earlier no longer fit what stood in front of him. The faint mark along her cheek, the quiet steadiness in her posture, the way her hands no longer moved to clean, but simply rested against the table, all of it sat there without accusation, without demand, yet impossible to ignore. It was an accident, Ryan said finally, his voice lower, less certain, as if testing the words before committing to them. Coffee spilled. Things got misunderstood. The explanation hung there, incomplete, thin against the weight of the moment. Marcus did not interrupt. He let the statement settle, let it be heard fully, then allowed a brief pause to follow, long enough for the absence of truth to become noticeable on its own. The ticking of the clock above the counter seemed louder now, each second carving space into the silence. Misunderstood, Marcus repeated, not as a challenge, not even as a question, but as if placing the word under light to see what it revealed. His gaze did not leave Ryan's face, steady and patient, the kind of patience that did not rush because it did not need to. Ryan shifted again, his shoulders tightening, his fingers brushing against the edge of his belt before falling still, unsure where to rest. She was being difficult, he added, the words coming quicker this time, though they lacked the firmness he intended. Refused to step back, would not listen. A quiet breath moved through the room, subtle but collective, as if people were remembering something they had witnessed just moments ago and realizing it did not match what they were hearing now. Marcus's eyes flicked once more to Evelyn, taking in her stillness, the absence of any raised voice, any resistance, any sign of disorder. Then he looked back at Ryan. Did she raise her voice? He asked calmly. Ryan hesitated. No. Did she threaten anyone? Marcus continued, his tone unchanged, each question measured, precise. Ryan's jaw tightened. No. Did she refuse a lawful order that you clearly issued? The question lingered a fraction longer, not because it was louder, but because it required something Ryan could not easily reshape. He exhaled, a controlled breath that did little to steady him. No, he said again, softer this time. Marcus nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just the answers, but the space they left behind. He took a small step to the side, just enough to shift the angle of the moment, to include the room without turning it into a spectacle. Then help me understand, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables without rising. What part of this required escalation? The word did not accuse. It clarified. Ryan's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, catching the faint outline of the coffee stain that had begun to spread outward, dark against the light tile, a quiet reminder of where this had started. For a moment, he said nothing. The confidence that had filled his posture earlier seemed to thin, replaced by something less defined, something closer to awareness. Behind him, a chair shifted slightly as someone adjusted their seat, the soft scrape against the floor echoing more than it should have. Evelyn remained composed, her eyes now resting gently on Marcus, not with expectation, not with urgency, but with a quiet trust that did not need to be spoken. And in that still, measured space between question and answer, it became clear that whatever came next would not be decided by force or volume, but by the simple weight of what could no longer be denied. Ryan's silence stretched longer this time, not empty, but heavy, like something pressing down from the inside, forcing him to stand still in a way he was not used to. And for a moment, he seemed to search for an answer that would restore the version of himself he had walked in with, the one that did not question, did not hesitate, did not get questioned back. His fingers curled slightly, then released, a small movement that betrayed more than his words had. It was not escalation, he said at last, though the statement felt weaker now, as if it had already begun to fold under its own weight. It was control. The word lingered, uncertain, as though even he was not convinced it belonged there anymore. Marcus did not react immediately. He let the word settle in the space between them, allowed it to echo softly against the quiet presence of the room, against the still figure of Evelyn, against the eyes of people who had witnessed everything without saying a single thing. Control, Marcus repeated, slower this time, his tone unchanged but the meaning sharper, more defined, like a line being drawn with precision rather than force. His gaze shifted briefly to the coffee stain on the floor, now spreading wider, uneven at the edges, its shape no longer contained. Control is usually quiet, he continued, his voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. It does not leave a room. Like this. Ryan's jaw tightened again, but this time it did not hold. His eyes flickered toward the surrounding tables, catching glimpses of people who quickly looked away, not wanting to be seen but unable to forget what they had already seen. The room no longer felt like a place where he could assert himself. It felt like a place where something had already been decided. "You are making this bigger than it is," Ryan said, though the words lacked the force they once carried, sounding more like a request than a declaration. Marcus took another small step forward, not aggressive, not imposing, just enough to close the distance where avoidance could no longer hide. "No," he said quietly, "I am making it exactly what it is." The clarity in his voice did not rise, but it settled deeply, leaving no room for interpretation. Behind him, a chair shifted again, a glass clinked softly against a saucer, the ordinary sounds of the diner beginning to return in fragments, but none of them strong enough to break the focus of the moment. Evelyn remained still, her hands now resting lightly against the edge of the table, her gaze calm, not fixed on Ryan, not even on Marcus, but somewhere between them, as if she understood that the truth did not need to be pointed at to be present. Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath longer this time, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension no longer holding in the same way. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could reshape it, carrying a trace of frustration, but also something else, something closer to uncertainty. Marcus held his gaze, steady and unyielding, but not unkind. "Start with what actually happened," he replied, his tone even, almost quiet, yet firm enough that it did not need to repeat itself. The clock on the wall ticked again, marking another second that felt longer than it should, and in that space, Ryan's expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to suggest that the version of the story he had been holding on to was no longer enough to stand on. He looked once more at Evelyn, really looked this time, at her stillness, her dignity, the absence of anything. That justified what had unfolded, and for the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes, no quick explanation waiting behind them. Only the quiet realization that the moment had moved beyond him, beyond control, into something that required more than authority to answer for. The silence did not break all at once. It softened, like a room slowly remembering how to breathe again. But no one spoke, not yet, because something about the moment demanded stillness rather than sound. Ryan looked down at his hands, turning them slightly as if seeing them for the first time, as if trying to understand how something so small had become something this large. The badge on his chest caught the light again, but it no longer seemed to carry the same weight it had when he first walked in. It was just metal now, reflecting what was in front of it. He inhaled, deeper this time, the kind of breath that did not come from habit but from necessity, and when he lifted his eyes again, they did not search the room for support. They settled, quietly, on Evelyn. She had not moved, not in any way that demanded attention. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her posture upright, her presence unchanged, as if she had been standing in the same place long before this moment began and would remain there long after it ended. The soft lines in her face held no anger, no expectation, only a patience that felt older than the room itself. Ryan's voice, when it came, was different. Not loud, not sharp, just stripped of everything it had been carrying before. "The coffee spilled," he said, slower now, each word placed carefully, as if he were choosing not just what to say, but how much of it to own. "I thought she was not paying attention. I assumed." He stopped, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could fully form. The word assumed lingered in the air, heavier than anything he had said so far. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not need to. He stood still, his presence steady, allowing the space for something real to emerge without forcing it forward. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation above them, the faint hum filling the quiet gaps between breaths. Somewhere near the kitchen, a plate was set down gently, the sound careful, almost respectful of what was unfolding. Ryan swallowed again, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to Evelyn, not with challenge, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition. "I should have handled it differently," he added, the words quieter, but clearer than anything before. Evelyn's eyes softened just slightly, not in approval, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting not for an apology, but for truth to find its way to the surface. She reached for another napkin, this time not to clean quickly, but to finish what had been left undone, her movements calm, deliberate, unhurried. She knelt slightly, pressing the napkin against the edge of the stain, absorbing what remained, her hands steady despite the faint tremor that never fully left them. Marcus watched for a moment, then stepped forward just enough to take a clean cloth from the nearby counter, handing it to her without a word. Their fingers did not touch, but the gesture carried something unspoken, something understood. Evelyn accepted it with a small nod, continuing her work, not because she had to, but because it was what she had always done, finishing what others left behind. Ryan stood still, watching, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present, as if he had been placed inside a moment he could not walk out of until he fully understood it. The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not tense, not held, but reflective, like something had settled into place without needing to announce itself. And in that quiet, with the stains slowly disappearing beneath careful hands and steady breath, it became clear that the moment had shifted again, not through authority, not through force, but through something far more difficult to ignore, the simple act of seeing clearly what had been there all along. The last traces of the coffee stain faded into the cloth in Evelyn's hands, the dark edges dissolving into something lighter, something that no longer drew the eye. And for a moment she remained there, slightly bent, as if making sure nothing had been left behind, as if completion mattered even when no one was asking for it. Then she straightened slowly, her back careful but steady, and folded the cloth once, pressing it lightly between her palms before setting it aside on the table. The simple act carried a quiet finality, not dramatic, not announced, but unmistakable. Ryan watched the movement without speaking, his eyes following her hands, then lifting to her face again, searching not for permission, not for instruction, but for something he could not quite name. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the motion subtle, grounding, his presence unchanged yet somehow more defined now that the tension had given way to something clearer. He reached into his pocket again, not for his badge this time, but for a small notebook, worn at the edges, the kind used for details that could not be forgotten. He opened it with one hand, flipping to a blank page, the faint scratch of paper against paper sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. "I am going to document what happened here," he said calmly, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of process, of accountability that did not depend on emotion. Ryan nodded once, the motion immediate, almost reflexive, as if resisting it no longer made sense. "Yes, sir," he replied, the words steady, though quieter than before. Marcus glanced toward the surrounding tables, his eyes moving across the room with quiet intention. "If anyone witnessed the interaction," he continued, "I would like a statement." For a moment, no one moved. Then a man at the counter shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly, his hand lifting just slightly before settling again, as if testing the courage to be seen. A young woman near the window reached for her phone, not to record, but to stop the recording she had already taken, her expression uncertain, thoughtful. The silence did not feel empty now. It felt like a space where choices were being made. Evelyn remained still, her gaze moving gently from Marcus to Ryan and then back again, not intervening, not directing, simply present, her calmness anchoring the room in a way that no authority could replicate. Ryan took a small step back, creating a bit more distance, not out of retreat, but out of recognition, as if understanding that the space no longer belonged to him in the way he had assumed. He adjusted his stance again, but this time it was not to appear larger. It was to stand properly, evenly, without leaning on anything that was not his own. "I will cooperate fully," he said, the words clearer now, not forced, not defensive, just stated, as if accepting something that had already been decided. Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without amplifying it, his pen moving across the page in steady lines, capturing what needed to be remembered. The clock on the wall ticked again, marking another second that no longer felt suspended, but part of a flow that had resumed. Outside, a car passed by, its engine fading into the distance, ordinary life continuing just beyond the glass. Inside, the diner remained quiet, but it was a different quiet now, one shaped by awareness rather than tension, by truth rather than uncertainty. Evelyn reached for the edge of the table once more, smoothing it lightly with her palm, not because it needed it, but because it was what she did, finishing small things with care. And as Marcus closed his notebook and lifted his gaze again, it became clear that the moment had turned fully, not into something louder, not into something harsher, but into something steady and undeniable, where what had happened would not be erased, and what came next would be shaped not by power, but by responsibility. Evelyn reached for the edge of the chair beside her and eased herself down slowly, not out of weakness, but with the quiet care of someone who respected her own limits, her hands resting gently in her lap as the room around her continued to settle into a calmer rhythm. The tension that had once filled every corner of the diner had thinned, replaced by something more reflective, more aware, like a space that had just witnessed something it would not forget. Marcus slipped the notebook back into his pocket, the motion small but deliberate, signaling that what needed to be recorded had been acknowledged, at least for now. He turned slightly toward Evelyn, his posture softening in a way it had not before, not losing authority, but revealing something underneath it, something personal. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice no longer carrying across the room, but meant only for her. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes warm, steady, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips as if the question itself mattered more than the answer. "I am just fine," she said gently, her tone calm, unshaken, carrying the same quiet strength that had held her through the entire moment. Marcus studied her for a brief second, not doubting her words, but understanding what they meant beyond their surface, then gave a small nod, accepting it without pressing further. Ryan remained standing a few feet away, his hands now resting at his sides, no longer searching for his belt, no longer reaching for anything that might reinforce who he thought he was. He looked at Evelyn again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that seemed unfamiliar even to him. "Ma'am," he began, the word careful, deliberate. He paused, the rest of the sentence catching somewhere between intention and hesitation. The room did not rush him. No one spoke. Even the small background sounds seemed to soften, as if giving space for something that needed to be said without interruption. "I handled that wrong," he said finally, the words simple, direct, without decoration. He did not look away this time. He held the moment, held the truth of it, letting it stand on its own. Evelyn's gaze remained steady on him, not sharp, not judging, just present, as if she had already understood what he was struggling to articulate. She gave a slight nod, acknowledging the words without elevating them, without turning them into something larger than they were. "We all have moments," she replied softly, her voice carrying across the quiet room, gentle but clear. "What matters is what we do after them." The statement did not accuse. It did not excuse. It simply existed, balanced, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Humility. He nodded once, a small motion, but real. Marcus watched the exchange without interruption, his expression composed, yet there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something that reflected not just oversight, but understanding. He stepped slightly to the side, creating space rather than filling it, allowing the moment between them to complete itself naturally. Around them, the diner began to breathe again. A server near the counter picked up a coffee pot, moving carefully between tables. A couple resumed their conversation in hushed tones. The ordinary sounds of life returned, not abruptly, but gradually, like a tide coming back in. Evelyn adjusted her apron lightly, smoothing the fabric with her palms, a simple gesture that brought her back into the rhythm of her day. And as Ryan stood there, no longer the center of the room, no longer the one in control, it became clear that something far more lasting had taken its place. Not loud, not forceful, but steady and undeniable. The quiet shift of a man beginning to understand the weight of his actions and the meaning of being seen clearly for the first time. The light outside had shifted by the time the moment fully settled. The late afternoon sun angling lower through the diner windows, casting longer shadows across the floor and catching the edges of small things that usually went unnoticed. The rim of a coffee cup, the curve of a spoon, the faint crease in a napkin folded with care. Evelyn rose from her chair slowly, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if nothing in the past few minutes had rushed her out of herself, and she reached for the cloth again, giving the table one final, gentle pass, not because it needed it, but because it was how she closed a task, fully, without leaving anything unfinished behind. Marcus stood a step away, watching quietly, his presence no longer pressing, no longer directing, just there, steady, like something that had done what it came to do and now understood the value of stepping back. Ryan remained where he was, but he did not stand the same way anymore. The sharp edges of his posture softened, his shoulders no longer held high out of habit, but resting naturally, as if the weight he had carried in had finally shifted into something he could not ignore, but also no longer needed to defend. The badge on his chest still caught the light, but now it reflected something different, not authority, not control, but a moment he would carry long after he walked out that door. Evelyn placed the cloth down, smoothing it once with her palm, then looked up, her gaze moving from Marcus to Ryan and back again, not measuring, not judging, just seeing, fully and without resistance. "It is a good day," she said softly, almost to herself, though the words carried just enough to be heard, simple and complete, like something that did not need explanation to be true. Marcus gave a slight nod, understanding the weight of what she meant, not because the day had been easy, but because it had been honest. He reached into his pocket once more, pulling out a card, placing it gently on the edge of the table near her, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, just leaving it there as an option, a quiet assurance that what had happened would not be forgotten. "If you need anything," he said, his voice low, steady, "you call me." Evelyn glanced at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying a depth of gratitude that did not need to be spoken aloud. She nodded once. Ryan took a breath, then another, as if learning again how to stand in a space without trying to shape it, and with a small, deliberate movement, he stepped back, giving space where he once would have taken it. He looked at Evelyn one last time, not searching for anything now, not asking for more, just acknowledging her presence, her dignity, the quiet strength that had never left her even when the room had shifted around her. Then he turned, his steps measured, not hurried, moving toward the door with a different awareness than when he had entered, the bell chiming softly as he pushed it open, the sound no longer sharp, but ordinary again. The door closed behind him, and the light shifted once more, settling back into its place across the floor. Inside, the diner breathed fully again. Conversations resumed, low and steady. A fresh pot of coffee was poured. A plate was set down with care. Life continued, not as if nothing had happened, but as if something had been understood. Evelyn adjusted her apron, tying the knot a little tighter, then reached for a clean cup, filling it with coffee, the steam rising gently into the warm air. Marcus watched for a moment longer, then turned as well, walking toward the door, but before he stepped out, he glanced back once, just briefly, taking in the scene not as a problem, not as a case, but as something whole, something resolved in a way that did not need noise to be real. Evelyn caught that glance and offered the smallest smile, one that did not ask for recognition, but gave it freely. The clock on the wall ticked steadily above them, each second moving forward without pause, without hesitation. And in that quiet rhythm, With the light settling, the room breathing, and the people within it returning to their lives, the moment closed not with a final word, but with something deeper, something that lingered in the stillness between sounds, the quiet presence of justice felt, not spoken.